Since birth, we've been conditioned to love and root for the main character of any given story. In children's books and movies, the main character is almost always morally righteous, fighting for a good cause, often against an evil entity. Think of Simba and Scar, or Aladdin and Jafar. There's never any question of who you should be rooting for. As we grow older, the media we consume tends to become a bit more nuanced, but more often than not, the lead character is still someone we're meant to like. It keeps things simple, easy to follow, and easy to connect with. But not all stories work that way. It's not uncommon, especially within auteur-driven cinema, for films to follow morally questionable characters. Characters who are selfish, manipulative, or even outright evil. People we probably shouldn't be rooting for. They exist in many shapes and sizes, and serve many purposes. In this video, I'll explain why morally ambiguous characters are such a powerful storytelling tool, how easy it is for audiences to misunderstand them, and what qualities make for a good or bad character, with plenty of examples along the way. But before I continue, feel free to subscribe if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it very much. So let's start with the obvious question. Why even write a morally ambiguous character in the first place? Why not just stick with someone likable? Well, at the end of the day, likable characters don't really challenge the audience, they guide them. In general, they tell you how to feel, who to root for, and when to feel satisfied. There's a certain level of comfort in that, and there's nothing inherently wrong with it, but it does limit what a story can do. Once you shift your focus to a morally questionable character, that comfort begins to disappear. You're no longer just watching a story unfold, you're engaging with it on a more complex level. You're constantly reassessing how you feel about the person you're following, and sometimes even questioning why you're still following them at all. That's what makes someone like Walter White in Breaking Bad so compelling. You're not just watching someone become a worse person, you're watching him convince himself that he isn't. The show doesn't rely on a single turning point where he suddenly becomes evil. Instead, everything is built on small, incremental decisions that feel justified in the moment. By the time Walter fully embraces who he really is, it doesn't feel like a transformation. It just feels like his true self being revealed. The idea of a character revealing their true selves, rather than changing, shows up in very different ways across film. In Taxi Driver, Travis Bickle doesn't go through a traditional character arc. If anything, he just sinks deeper into the same mindset he starts with. But because the film does such a great job placing you in his perspective, everything he does makes sense. It's not necessarily agreeable, but it's understandable. The world is corrupt, people are disgusting, and something needs to be done. His conclusions are extreme, but the logic behind them is consistent. You're not being told to agree with him, but you understand how he thinks, and that's enough to carry the film. On the other end of the spectrum, you have characters who aren't violent or outwardly dangerous, but are still challenging to spend time with. In The Mother and the Whore, Alexandre is the kind of person who can talk for hours without actually saying anything meaningful. He intellectualizes everything, constantly justifies his own behavior, and ultimately makes a big fool of himself. There's nothing exaggerated about him. People like him exist everywhere, which is exactly why he's so frustrating to watch. At least for most people. I actually love watching him. He's one of my favorite characters of all time. You see a similar kind of behavior in Jerome from Claire's Knee, although in his case it's much more disturbing. He treats the young girls around him less like people and more like social experiments. Everything is filtered through this intellectual lens where he convinces himself that what he's doing is harmless, even meaningful, when in reality he's crossing some serious boundaries. The film itself never outright condemns him, but it doesn't need to. The discomfort comes from how casually he justifies himself. That's something a lot of these characters have in common. They don't see themselves as the problem. In May December, Natalie Portman's character approaches someone else's trauma as material, something to study and decipher. She convinces herself that she's doing it for the sake of authenticity, but there's something darker going on beneath the surface. She's not malicious in a traditional sense, but rather exploitative. Another recent example of someone who fits into this idea is Marty Mauser from Marty Supreme. He's not some supervillain, nor is he particularly calculated. He's just selfish, egotistical, and self-destructive. The kind of person who can't stop making bad decisions and dragging others into them. He's not irredeemable, but he's walking trouble. As interesting as these characters are, they're also very easy to misinterpret, and I think there are two main ways that happens. The first is when audiences fully buy into the character's perspective. Instead of engaging with the story critically, they take everything at face value and end up seeing the character as someone to admire. Walter White is the clearest example of this. Even as the show makes it obvious that his actions are driven by ego and control, there are still so many people who see him as the hero. You see a similar kind of surface level reading with Travis Bickle, where people treat his behavior as justified instead of recognizing how broken his worldview is. And then there are cases where the problem isn't the audience, it's the film itself. Take a look at Derek Vineyard from American History X. For most of the runtime, the film is very clear about who he is. A violent, hateful person responsible for horrible acts. It doesn't hold back at all, but then his quote-unquote redemption is rushed through in a way that feels absurdly simple. He goes to prison, befriends a black inmate, and suddenly we're basically meant to accept that he's a completely changed person. I'm not saying a transformation like that couldn't work, but here it doesn't feel earned. It feels like the film skipping steps, ultimately undermining both the character and the message. The second misunderstanding is rejecting a film entirely because the main character is a bad person. This tends to happen more with slower observational films. Characters like Alexandre or Jerome aren't meant to be likable and they're not meant to be redeemed. The point is to observe them, to understand how their minds work, and to think about how they reflect society. But if you go into those films expecting someone to root for, you're probably going to come away frustrated. That's not a flaw in the film, it's just a mismatch in expectations. Of course, not every morally ambiguous character works, and when they don't, it usually comes down to one of two things. Either the film softens them up too much, or it doesn't fully explore them. John Bender in The Breakfast Club is a good example of the former. The film clearly wants you to see him as this misunderstood rebel, but then it glosses over his truly deplorable actions and gives him an undeserved happy ending. He doesn't feel like a fully realized character, but rather a half-finished idea. Then you have something like the recent Wuthering Heights adaptation with Margot Robbie and Jacob Elordi, which runs into a different problem. The characters are inherently toxic and manipulative, but the film barely explores that. Instead, it leans into a more traditional romance angle, which just doesn't fit the material. As a result, the characters feel watered down. They're still technically the same people, but stripped of the depth that made them compelling in the first place. It ends up feeling like the film is avoiding what these characters actually are instead of confronting it. And that's really what it comes down to. If you're not willing to fully engage with a character's flaws, then the ambiguity stops meaning anything. At the end of the day, writing a morally ambiguous character isn't about making someone edgy or controversial for the sake of it. It's about creating a character who feels real enough that their actions, no matter how questionable, make sense within the context of who they are. You don't have to agree with them, and you don't have to like them. In a lot of cases, you probably shouldn't. But if the writing is strong enough, you'll understand them. And that's usually a lot more interesting than simply rooting for them. And you know what? That's all I have to say for now. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.